السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يتشرف صندوق التنمية السياحي ممثلا بمركز نمو السياحة بالترحيب بكم بمناسبة تدشين البرامج التدريبية والجلسات المتطورة، والتي من شأنها أن تعزز من تطوير وتنمية طاقاتكم الإبداعية، وبما ينعكس أيضا على مشاريعكم وترجمتها على أرض الواقع بصفتكم رواد أعمال طموحين، وذلك عبر سلسلة من البرامج والجلسات ذات المواضيع القيمة وأيضا النقاشات المثرية، وذلك بالتعاون مع حاضنة المشتل الإبداعية. تنطلق اليوم على بركة الله أولى الجلسات التدريبية تحت عنوان صناعة سياحية ثقافية مستدامة، حيث تهدف إلى رفع خبرتكم بمجموعة من مفاهيم الاقتصادات الإبداعية المتنامية، مثل الاستدامة الثقافية والتصميم الثقافي، كما ستمكنكم أيضا من التعمق في عدة مجالات رئيسية، مثل استراتيجيات الاستدامة الثقافية المطبقة بالفعل في إقامة قطاعات السياحة بدول أخرى حول العالم، أيضا المسارات المستقبلية التي يمكن استكشافها في هذا المجال داخل المملكة العربية السعودية، أيضا الصناعات الإبداعية الجاذبة للسياح المعاصرين، سواء بعناصرها غير المادية أو المادية المستمدة من التراث الثقافي. الإخوة والأخوات الحضور، نود أيضا أن نلفت انتباهكم إلى أن الجلسة تقدم باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية، ويمكنكم اختيار اللغة المفضلة عبر الضغط على أيقونة الكرة الأرضية أسفل الشاشة لديكم. نرحب أيضا باستفساراتكم ومداخلاتكم في نهاية الجلسة بمشيئة الله عبر خاصية المحادثات. الآن اسمحوا لي أن أدعو السيدة ماجي جونك، خبيرة المجال الثقافي والمهتمة بالممارسات الحرفية واستدامتها من منظور ثقافي، لتقديم هذه الجلسة، فلتتفضل مشكورة.
Ms. Maggie, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cultural Sustainability, Design and Tourism. And this is a quick session on some collaborative possibilities that I've seen. So we'll get started right away. A quick welcome to everybody. Oh, pardon me. First, I'd like to go over quickly what our session plan is for today. I'll be sharing some information on a subject that's very important to me and is my key research interest, which is cultural sustainability and design. And just a quick thank you before we get started to everybody who's here. And I'd also like to just thank ITHRA quickly, because this talk is built on a workshop that I developed with them, and they did help provide some insight. So a quick thank you to them for that. So let's start out with our quick overview of what we'll be covering today, and I'll follow that with an introduction of myself and my work. First, we'll be looking separately at culture and design. What are they? What are some of the key characteristics? And how do they exist within our societies, and how do we interact with it? We will then look at what happens with, in an ethical and meaningful way, when culture and design come together. This type of interaction will be highlighted by local and international examples, each playing off of strengths specific to their culture, their making groups, and invested parties. We'll also explore the dangers of these collaborations, if not done with ethics as a top priority, and how to avoid any mistakes that could have negative impacts on the communities involved. With a solid understanding of how culture, sustainability, and design can interact, we will then begin to explore where tourism can come in, through process and through product. Process will look at the idea of culture and craft tourism, some key examples, potential dangers, and the role of the designer and what they can have with these experiences. Through product, we'll first speak briefly about appropriation and appreciation, which are two key terms that are very important and very central to this conversation. This will be followed by examples of companies working ethically with culture and heritage, contributing to an authentic and complicated local design narrative, and through their products, disseminating key cultural characteristics around the globe. Our final subject will be two reflective activities, the first being an explanation of the, our final subject will be two reflective activities, the first being an explanation of the breakdown and build-up technique that I use when bringing culture and design together, and the second is on ethics. So now a little bit about myself. I'm a fashion designer by training, and I also do a lot of work in cultural research. I have dogs, I'm a cyclist, and I love exploring. I found myself all over the world with my work, which is something I really enjoy doing quite often lately in Saudi Arabia, which I really enjoy my trips over there. I've included my email and my Instagram handle if anybody has follow-up questions or any interest in any of the material from this talk today. And a little bit about my research and my work. So I work between industry and education, and I've been spending the last 10 years contributing to the growing creative economies across the Middle East. I started by co-founding a design studio called OEO in Dubai, and I quickly found myself exploring more sustainable approaches to production. And that brought me back to my initial interest in culture and artisanal practices. Focusing on sustainability through a cultural lens, I've continued to research and create educational programs on the subject. So that's just a little about me, in case you're wondering why I'm here and why I'm talking about all of this. Before diving into the subject, I like to take a look closely at the definitions of words. So here we have culture and design, and let's just analyze the definitions quickly. Key things that I want to point out about the word culture is that it's a manifestation of human intellectual achievements, and there's a collective effort. So I really want to highlight that idea of intellectual achievements. It's something we'll be coming back to later in the conversation. And then also that it's complex. It's ideas, customs, social behaviors. So it's very intricate, and it is very specific to different people and their society. So that's what gives us that variation of culture globally. And then secondly, looking at design, in this definition, I just really want to highlight this idea of planning and a process. So we'll discuss that later on as well, but how design and this idea of a plan, a process is really kind of integral to the word itself. So what exactly is culture? It is a term we throw around a lot, specifically when trying to differentiate ourselves or explain behaviors. You know, we say things like we're from different cultures, or that a behavior is a cultural thing. But what makes up our culture, and why does it have such a strong impact on our interactions? I'd like to break down culture into 5 key elements, and all highlighted by examples from within Saudi Arabia. Please note that I'm not making any assumptions that the entirety of the kingdom has one cohesive culture. I know that it's very complex, but there's also this idea of a national identity as well. So just a kind of little side note that I know that there's a lot of different groups and different subcultures, but we're just looking more generally now. So social, the first one is social. These are the interactions that we have not only within our own culture, but cross-culturally as well. So it's how we divide ourselves, how we organize ourselves within our society. What rules, whether they're written or just kind of socially known rules, do we have, and how do we behave? What do we aspire to? All of these behaviors are social interactions, and they are a very key component of culture. The next component of culture is the arts, with the arts encompassing all types of expressions that exist within a cultural group, be it locally or internationally derived. The artworks found at Aula, for example, although created by an international artist, are now part of the local contemporary culture and a reflection of our completely intertwined and complicated world with rapid movements of thoughts and ideas. Holding just as important of a place, we have traditional art forms as well, and while often at a slower pace, shift and change as the culture does. It is so important to note that culture itself is not static. It is this continually changing and is influenced heavily by our global interactions. The only thing about a culture that is a fact is that it is always changing. Knowledge is, I find, a very interesting component of culture because of the variety of forms that it comes in. It can be intellectual achievements and advancements, for example, like math or medicine. And it can be the information and the social political lens that we apply to our information. They're shared through publication like Saudi's first ever paper, from what I've been told, Qura. I wasn't around, but I've been told that is the very first paper that was published in Saudi Arabia. It can also come from very informal, often unwritten versions, the stories that we tell and folklore, which the work of Dr. Lamia covers. It's full of important and invaluable cultural information, such as social ideas and hierarchies, traditional practices, even observations about weather and food practices. The list goes on. These unique knowledge sets help shape and form our everyday habits, practices, and our rituals. Next, we have belief systems. They're another key component of culture and shape our views of our own and the outside world. Belief systems are the moral compass of our culture. They determine how we structure our years, our time of celebration, and our time of rest. Most importantly, belief systems unite us. As humans, we have the ability to have close relationships with about 150 people only, and this is known as the Dunbar's number. But how do we create bonds across a nation? For example, what unites millions of people? Often it's our belief system. If it's a belief in a national identity, for example, or in a god, or in a ruler, our beliefs, they bring us together and they unite us. So thinking and reflecting on Mecca, for example, how do millions of people from across the globe come together for an experience that connects and unites them? It's through their beliefs. And our final element of culture, and perhaps the most easy to understand, is our customs and our habits. So these can be as mundane as the clothing that we wear from, in our day-to-day, or the way that we serve our coffee, to as special as celebrations or dance that help to punctuate the year. Our customs and habits often also require material objects or material culture. So the coffee cup that we drink from, for example, there are different shapes and sizes because of the customs and habits that we have. In North America, Canada, where I'm from, coffee comes in, it's almost like a liter cup, because we drink big quantities and very weak. When you compare that to how coffee is drunk across the Arab world, for example, it's very different. Our clothing, transportation, home decor, it's all formed and aligned with our specific cultural habits and our customs. So this is culture. Now we'll move on to design. So what exactly is design? It's complicated, but technically everything was designed at some point in time, from a pencil to a computer to the design pieces that we have here. And even the poorest functioning items were designed. When we talk about design, we often talk about, design with this like capital D, like the design world. Those are products considered to be at the very top of the market. They're so perfectly designed to reflect the needs of society, communicate our values, and be aesthetically pleasing, of course, and function impeccably. Examples of design are Sota's Tahiti table lamp, for example, or Stark's ghost chair, which I think everybody can recognize. They're seen as being iconic. What really makes design, for me, is the process. The idea of process of having a clear beginning and an iterative process, having a that seeks perfection. The idea of an intention is that's what for me defines design. This is often where culture and design have a clash point, culture being very fluid and design seen as being quite intentional. But the reality is, however, that culture often does often follow at least parts of the design process. And the design itself is an element of culture, but we'll continue with our exploration of design for now. So two more iconic examples of design, which bring up the idea of being iconic. I think this is another key part of that design with a capital D. Design often is the result of a brief, assignment, and the designers respond to it. And with some designs, that brief is to become known, to be a piece that rests within society. So you have that iconicness about them. But being iconic, however, doesn't mean necessarily expensive, like our last examples. So take the example of a Converse shoe, an IKEA mug, or a Swatch watch. All three are perfect examples of design. They completely fill the brief and they meet all the needs of the end client. A Swatch watch needs to be affordable, it needs to be functional, it needs to be fun, and above all, it needs to be reliable. They need to be produced in mass, with each and every design being produced identically. They need to be predictable, easy to access, and constantly in stock. These are some very key characteristics of this type of quickly consumed design. That was the brief, and Swatch replied perfectly to it. It was to make an affordable, stylish watch that had all of those kind of elements of reliability and perfection within them. The same for Converse shoes and the IKEA mug. There may be better quality designs that exist, more elaborate, more elegant designs, but when accessibility and affordability are put as two equally important factors, designers take this into consideration for the design because all aspects of that brief should be met. Now, what happens when we bring these two together in a correct way? And I emphasize this on the correct way because there's very much an ethical approach to bringing culture and design together. And as we'll see later, there's some very unethical ways to go about it as well. Well, we have results like this when it's done well. Very unique and authentic products that are produced in collaboration with local artisans or perhaps heritage practitioners and knowledge keepers, proving that the culture is in fact not in opposition of design, but rather completely fluid and adaptable part of human existence that have a place within our contemporary markets. So how can design incorporate culture? It's through a very thoughtful and ethical collaboration with knowledge keepers, artisans, traditional makers, and it respects and honors the culture it represents in an appropriate and meaningful way. The key words here are respect, honor, appropriate, meaningful. We'll see later how these play out into the process. And how is it all done? By working with a set of best practices and guidance, engaging with both the design process and culturally specific practitioners, practices, knowledge, habits, and customs. So again, keyword here is the best practice, guidance, engaging. You know, these types of collaborations do not successfully happen just by chance. They're pursued and they require a lot of reflection, understanding, and patience on both parts. So here are some more examples. We'll just go through them. They're from private brands, but I feel that they highlight also a national ambition for this as well because of the support that a lot of them receive. So the first example here, it's called Nada Duele, which in Spanish actually means nothing hurts. I think it's quite a beautiful name. They work with a variety of practices and techniques, engaging with local artisans in an open and very collaborative manner. The DA brand, the process and the results here I think are wonderful. They're from Nigeria, and the collection was inspired by the tools used in the designer's mom's kitchen. So completely culturally functional, but with a very contemporary aesthetic. So bringing traditional food practices and merging them with very beautiful contemporary objects. And then we also have Balsa. They're from Mexico, and they saw the dying balsa weaving industry, and by collaborating with local practitioners, we're able to design and create relevant products that help restart the industry and preserve this cultural knowledge set of weaving. Some more examples of when culture and design collaborate, and these are all from a bit closer to home. Bokia, working with traditional embroidered textiles. The Anna collection, pivoting the skill set of Syrian refugee women, turning embroidery into a meaningful and gainful employment opportunity. And finally, Abadia, who focuses on supporting craftsmanship and creating ethically made products. While these types of collaborations are different, each focusing on specific strengths of the community, they all collectively produce unique design narratives. And this idea of design narrative, I think, is important for later on in our conversation when we start looking at how cultural sustainability and design come together with tourism. But unfortunately, these beautiful examples are not always the rule. These examples that we see are few and far between, and cultural sustainably designed products are not the norm that we see. So why is this happening? Well, there is a big disconnect between what are often categorized as artisanal, heritage, or cultural objects and what are categorized as design products. And this disconnect isn't without reason. Many of the accepted norms of the design industry clash with the reality of craft. The design processes focuses on producing for the masses, creating identical and optimized products, often through the intervention of machines, and this decouples the product from the social element of culture, which is the maker and their community. And decoupling the product from the social element of culture, this is where and why I see this disconnect happening. Most practitioners of craft and traditional or heritage products struggle with two expectations of the industry the industrial production of design produced. And this is this idea of being uniform and having firm deadlines. And there's a good reason why. Something that's made by hand, made by humans, embodies us as humans. You know, it's flawed, it's independent, it's creative, and it's changing. So this human element causes there to be small differences between a lot of handmade products. And these craft practitioners also practice as part of a community. And a community is messy, right? There's schedule changes, things come up, things are delayed. And this is where the design community struggles when working with craft and culture. It's this idea of consistency within product and deadlines, but it's because it's not something that was always necessary within the craft community. It was something that was understood and accepted that there would be these variations. But there's also a social problem, which is in a society that values the new, the innovative, and the cool, culture, which is completely interwoven with tradition and this long accumulation of practices and techniques, is overtaken by a global aesthetic, out with the old and in with the new. You know, buy more things more often, be trend-driven. Heritage practices often struggle with finding their place in a society that is continually motivated by the new. So why is this problematic? What happens when we decouple humans and the things that we make, the physical products of our society, with us as humans? I'll quickly run through some of the kind of major issues that I see when this happens. So the first is when we start looking at mass production of objects and clothing, we're potentially exposing marginalized communities to increased harm through this idea of mass production, right? Cheaper, faster, often results in poor working conditions. We also have a loss of meaningful work. So this idea of meaningful work is when you think of, you know, starting your own project at home, from ideation all the way to completion, there's a very satisfactory feeling that we get when you complete an entire work. When you look more towards the design industry, often it's based on, you know, like a Fordism type model of production. So this means you're doing piecework where you might only work on one very small component of something all the time. And that type of work doesn't provide the same satisfaction that you would get when you complete an entire project, for example. Another issue when we kind of decouple humans from the things that we make is that you have a loss of meaning in the objects. So because we have a loss of meaning in objects, we don't, you know, think of your favorite handmade ceramic mug that you have every morning with your coffee, or think of the IKEA mug. We don't have a lot of meaning placed into that IKEA mug because they're almost disposable in a way. They break, you buy another, it's not a big deal. So because of this, we quickly and prematurely dispose of things. We don't take the time to fix them. We get a new one because we don't like the color. We waste more. It also is encouraging consumers to overconsume. You know, we're always looking for more meaning in what we buy, so we buy more all the time. And then it also brings in this like negative connotation towards the idea of materialism. So in my view, being materialistic, it's not a bad thing if you understand materials, you know, if you have a real appreciation for how something is made and put together. But the word materialism right now is being used towards people who consume quickly and then also dispose quickly. So because we don't have a meaning in objects anymore, people aren't finding that materialism connection, but in a positive and meaningful way. We also have a devaluing of handmade things, which unfortunately leads to the devaluing of the maker themselves. I'll speak more about that later. and a loss of knowledge sets, because we don't find a lot of traditional and heritage practices important anymore. We often just let those knowledge sets disappear with the generations. And finally, we have a relocation, either locally or internationally, of labor. So everything's getting produced offshore or brought to, maybe from a rural setting to more centralized urban setting. This often leads to a rural loss of employment opportunities and favoring countries who have loose environmental impact laws, which then produces a more global effect. So you can see how before we had such a strong connection with our material world as part of our culture. And now, unfortunately, I'd say one of the negative side effects of a more industrialized and design-focused world is that we start to lose these connections. So the decoupling also causes some major issues that need to be addressed before designers can move towards focusing on bringing together culture within their designs. The first one that I want to talk about is an idea of value systems that I've highlighted here through two different objects. So there are two bird sculptures. One is done by Eames, and the other one is done in Ethiopia artisanally. And both, in my opinion, are beautiful, delicate, intricate, but the Eames bird is worth quite a lot more than the Ethiopian ceramic fowl, and also has a prestige that the Ethiopian bird doesn't have. But why is this? For me, it's because we put the label design on it. Once something becomes design, immediately the value rises in our society. Another example here, and I think this one is quite a good illustration, is the Vitra wooden dolls and the Japanese kokishi dolls. So for me, the issue here is that often these Vitra dolls are seen as holding more of a special place because they were designed. But the Swiss, in Vitra, the Swiss company, and the Japanese both have traditions of creating wooden dolls. So historically, they're both significant parts of their culture. But because the Vitra dolls are not just a product of a cultural practice, but they were in fact, designed with that big capital D, they seem to hold a certain legitimacy that often the Japanese dolls don't. And I find this practice, this valuing of objects, to be particularly dangerous for culture and design collaborations. If something's picked up and all of a sudden thrown into a design context, does that change the value of it in an appropriate way or not? Another big issue, we'll talk also more about this term later on, is appropriation. This is a really big one. Appropriation and appreciation are two very different but often confused terms. And I think the best way to illustrate the differences is through examples. So this first vest that you see, it was from a Dior collection. And the second is a traditional piece of clothing that was worn for centuries by the Bahor people. The two are almost identical. Now, this could have been an appreciation situation if it wasn't for a few key points. Appreciation being good, by the way, and appropriation being what we want to avoid. No permission was asked. The locals were not involved in the process, and they saw no benefits because of the production of the Dior vest. So their culture, their design, but nothing came back to the Bahor people of Romania. So this is what makes this appropriation. We have some other examples here as well. Gucci on the catwalk had a turban, very common to what is traditionally worn by people of the Sikh religion, but again, no credit was ever given, and it's seen as problematic to be celebrating something that's not yours without understanding the meaning and value behind it. Another example here is across the US in the South, the women practice weaving. The Navajo women have a specific design. Max Cosmetics just picked up that design and put it on a collection that they had, but without any real reason. There was no involvement of the Navajo women. The motifs were taken without any permission, and the only people to really benefit from this production was MAC. So you can see how this motif that they've developed over centuries within their weaving as part of their culture is property of that culture. And when brands take that property and use it for gain without giving anything back, this is where we have this issue of appropriation. The final two examples, the Chanel boomerang, which to me is just really bizarre. I don't understand what the connection ever was between the two. And again, no proceeds were ever given to the Indigenous people of Australia. And the final one for me, which is just like kind of appropriation ×2, is there's a dream catcher, which is a spiritual object in Indigenous Canadian and North American religions. And also there's the all-seeing eye, or the eye that was used in it as well. So you have two cultural symbols that hold a spiritual place that are brought together in a single object by Urban Outfitters without anybody ever seeing the benefit of that either. So you can see how this is, doubly offending. So these examples illustrated how culture can also be abused when design is brought into the picture, and is an issue for designers that designers need to overcome. These type of interactions, while they're very common, when called out, do not end well for either party. Often finding any kind of financial compensation for the cultural group is difficult, and the brand, if they ever are called out on it, are usually made example of publicly through bad press for the unjust interaction. So it is important to work towards not having this become part of the process, and to avoid buying products which may have resulted from an unjust interaction such as this. And the final issue that I see that needs to be addressed comes from the first issue of value systems. So we're so quick to associate people with the work that they do. It is often the second question that we ask when meeting someone. First is, what's your name? And the second is, what do you do? So you can see how a devaluing of the work of artisans can result in a devaluing of the practitioner. And this devaluing of an activity can turn into the accepting of a lower standard of living for the practitioner. We expect people who have those socially high value jobs to live in certain conditions, and we expect people, unfortunately, who don't have those type of jobs, who have jobs that are considered lower, to be okay with living in a lower standard of living. So as soon as we start devaluing a practice, that immediately reflects onto the person who does it, simply because our society so quickly translates the value of a person through their work. So remedying these issues is not easy and requires a lot of effort from both the designer, from the part of the designer, to ensure that the exchanges are ethical and the products are placed within the market appropriately, and the work of the artisan is valued. So how do we go about preventing these is through best practices. So there are some simple rules that I encourage all designers to employ when collaborating with culture, heritage, and craft. The first is to treat the artisan as a creative partner and not a skilled laborer. And that often means involving them within the design process. Examples of this is one company called Proyecto MA. They're from Mexico, and they collaborate quite closely with the artisans that make their products, and they also speak openly about that collaboration as well. So they are equally putting the designer and the craft person, they put them at the same level. Another example is the work that's done by Babatry Baskets. So these are baskets that are produced in Ghana, and all of their photography actually features the artisan who made the basket, so that this real sense of ownership, pride, and displaying them as a practicing artist is there. It adds a lot. I find it's very transparent and adds a lot of value to their products and to their story. Another one is understanding the design tradition before designing new products. So this is, I explained already about the DA brand, understanding the cooking techniques before developing tools for it, so that you are able to continue, traditional food practices through these contemporary tools. Another that I feel do a super job is Earthy Contemporary Craft Council. They're out of the UAE, and they work so closely on co-designing and understanding their processes with the artisans that they work with. Number 3 is assess the full impact of production. So this is something that Kalim, which is a company from Egypt, I find they do quite well just by constantly reevaluating the impact that they're having on the weaving community that they work with. And as well, Sabahar from Ethiopia, they have structured their business model to be able to accommodate different types of working depending on the social condition and the home condition of the different weavers. So for those who need to weave at home, for example, for childcare, they make those considerations. The 4th thing I think designers should always do is assess the impacts of engaging with the culture and their right to do so. So I think, for example, Bokia, that's something that they've done and they spoke about as well. They're using traditionally embroidered textiles. As a company, do they feel that they have the right to be doing that? Do they feel that they're giving better life to these products, and are they being true and honest to them? And another example is Ozeduro. They're from Ghana as well. And I think what's really interesting about them is that even though they're 2 North American women who started the company, who come from more privileged situations, they play their role as the designers way down, and they really highlight all of the hard work that's done by the local people in Ghana in building this. So even though the company was started by, like I said, 2 North American women, they really let the face and the image of the company be represented by the people who are actually making the clothing. And the 5th is consider the long-term impacts on the cultural group. Limala, I think, is a really great example. They're between Germany and Morocco, but they also, they make it a very important part of their conversation through their social media streams about correct terminology to use when referring to people from Morocco, for example, trying to use less colonized terms and bring back terms that better represent the people who live there. So they have a real educational element about their products, which is kind of their legacy as a brand. And the last is for Kinship. They're from the United States, and they actually work in a lot of different charities and kind of social projects to be able to not only elevate the people who they work with through their craft, but then also help elevate their social circumstances as well. So how does this all come together with tourism? What opportunities exist within cultural sustainability, design, and tourism? I have 2 very clear avenues for discussion and opportunities that I feel like lie within process and opportunities that lie within product. So we'll be looking first at this idea of process, and then we'll be following that by the idea of product. So through process, we often think only about the end result, the product, but the process has an incredible value, and every product tells a story. And understanding the process gives context and depth to that story. So a blanket, for example, was made with hand-spun wool. But who spun that yarn and how? And how long did it take, and where was it done? And how were the fibers collected to create the yarn in the first place? And were the yarns dyed by hand? And what natural dyes were used? And are the dye plants indigenous to the area? See, now I'm talking about local flora and fauna. I'm talking about lifestyle, and I'm talking about trade routes. Now I'm no longer talking just about a blanket, but I'm talking about a society and their culture. How can people experience process through craft and cultural tourism? This is more of an experience-based type tourism, and when related to craft, often it involves this idea of a workshop experience, and it's a chance for tourists to try the process themselves. Before, these types of experiences took years to manifest. They're often relied on a particularly driven and curious individual searching out practitioners of a specific heritage practice, and then convincing the community to teach them the craft. So in a roundabout way, the example of Baba Tree Baskets, their story is similar. The founder was searching for opportunities to engage with the drumming community in Ghana and came across the basket weaving process, and then the rest was history. But, people who are looking for those types of opportunities are few and far between, or they get deterred quite quickly if you're just especially looking at wanting to have this cultural experience as part of your vacation. So it all started with these people who were going off the beaten path and just trying to engage directly, but Now, through the popularity of workshops, this has become a lot easier for those seeking a hands-on experience. Companies such as Thread Caravan and Memoir, who I've never gone on their excursions before, so I'm not endorsing them in any way, but they are examples of companies who do provide these services. They provide experiences, or they like to call them immersions sometimes. These learning opportunities and local participations help carry cultural narratives back home with the tourists through the items that they've either made or open opportunities for international sharing through objects. In Mexico, for example, it's possible to learn how to use the natural dyes to color fibers and yarns and later weave them into flat carpets. Tourists can also participate in creating ceramics with locally specific traditions. While these experiences are often organized through private agencies, the overall national strategy to highlight the uniqueness of Mexico's craft sector has helped push these initiatives forwards. There's a lot of ongoing studies towards the success of this national strategy to see if it actually is trickling down to creating more employment opportunities for some often isolated communities and creating more tourism interest in those communities as well. Japan, who's long been known for the intricacy and quality of their craft, is home to similar experiences, and a very popular one being shibori dyeing with indigo dyes. And while the focus of the experience is on dyeing, participants also have an opportunity to experience a much less commercial and more authentic Japan. Again, these experiences align closely with Japan's national narrative of exquisite craftsmanship and tradition. Morocco is another popular destination for craft exploration, specifically in textiles and ceramics. And while one might not be able to weave an entire carpet, for example, in a single visit, the act of participation creates a lot of appreciation, which often translates into purchases, which is another way in which experience helps sustain local craft markets. These types of workshops, however, do not come without risk. One key worry that is often expressed is that of creating a spectacle of the practitioners and their homes, pulling focus away from the craft and making and turning their places of work into a sort of sideshow circus. I think that these two photos perfectly exemplify this. Both were taken in a way to appease like the tourist's gaze. To me, they read kind of "Welcome to our humble home. We are like here to serve you." They're from another organization's website that provides craft experiences. And rather than positioning the practitioners as accomplished and skilled, they appear to be, wait staff ready to meet the tourists' every need, and this often devalues the skill set in their work. This subject I find is a bit nuanced, I know, but because of the value put on heritage craft, which is right now low in a lot of contemporary society, often craftspeople are coming from lower social economic situations, and with tourists often having more spending capability, there's a power dynamic that emerges that can be quite often difficult to navigate. Other criticisms that I've seen is that because tourists who are often coming from these higher social economic situations, which result in them being able to afford to be a tourist in the first place, they have a higher standard of living, and some heritage practitioners and craft people feel they need to modify their place of work to fit this expectation. So things, for example, like modern toilets will be put into houses, but only to be used specifically for tourists. And this also creates another very awkward and unequal power dynamic. So how can these issues be avoided? I feel that this is where the role of the designer can be key. Designers are trained to understand needs. That is an essential part of all designers' work. The need of a manufacturer, the need of a supplier, the need of a consumer. A successful design balances all of these needs. So this is where I feel the designer can contribute to culture and craft tourism in creating an experience that is equal and fair to all who participate. That takes into consideration what the heritage and craft practitioners need and what experience the tourists are wanting, and also how this meets a national goal and strategies on national narratives. The second opportunity that I see is through product. While souvenir purchasing is not a new concept at all, it is true that increasingly most souvenirs are being made offshore. So bringing together design and craft creates opportunity for unique and contemporary items, essentially not always fridge magnets, creating opportunities to purchase meaningful and authentic souvenirs that drive local economies and contribute to local job creation. I think it's important to touch back quickly on appreciation and appropriation at this point. It's such a key notion when discussing products that result from collaborations between design and craft. So again, appreciation is seeking to understand and learn about and from other cultures in an effort to broaden perspectives and connect cross-culturally. Appropriation is simply taking one aspect of a culture that is not your own and using it for your own personal interest. So again, I really like to re-highlight this. I think it's something that's quite important and central to this entire conversation. So these products can also help drive tourism through other avenues, and not only as souvenir items. International design festivals and fairs, culture and craft exhibitions, they all help to draw attention and share this design narrative. Contemporary items that embody culture and craft can create international interest and attract those interested in understanding an active and thriving local design scene. For me personally, that's something I always look for when selecting a a vacation destination. I love going to see a lot of traditional, more heritage type sites and practices, but also I'm very interested in the contemporary design market, and I'm specifically looking for something that is different than what I'm used to seeing. And we have a real standardized version of design globally right now. So anything that sparks my interest is a definite pull for tourism. It's a chance to discuss more than, just the past, but at the same time give more than this kind of like empty design future, which we often see. An example and a story that I want to share about Kalim quite quickly. Their company was formed when trying to source traditional Kalims in Egypt that had a more contemporary design, something that they felt fit their aesthetic. When speaking with Noha, who's one of the co-founders, she mentioned something else that I think is an extremely important part of any national narrative, and it's this of creative capacity and intelligence. She explained that for her, the design work is often what is regarded as the intellectual bit of creating a product. Whether this is true or not, it's something that's, I agree with her that that's kind of the accepted idea. This is, where the concepts are formed, is the thinking part. And that having the Kalims that were designed and produced in Egypt was a show of national capability. They're not only producers, they're not only makers, they create, they design, they think. So really how working with artisans and designers together can help make that very complex narrative. Again, with Proyecto Ma from Mexico, they also do a fantastic job, of displaying their products, local creativity and making ability. Their projects, which have gained a lot of international attention, is helping drive interest in Mexico as a destination. Not to mention their products make fantastic take-homes as well, helping keep tourism dollars securely within the country and directly impacting local families. I'd like to also speak about Earthy Contemporary Craft Council. Their efforts to bring Emirati making culture international through participation in fairs, exhibitions, and events has helped firmly position the UAE as a cultural destination. Another important note is that their positioning of craft being luxury and high-end has helped to raise the perceived value of craftsmanship within the country, and it helps to attract a more sophisticated type of tourism. They've been able to, through craft, create an independent, complicated, and complete design narrative, which I think is quite a difficult task, but they've done it quite eloquently. Nada Duele, again, from Guatemala, while keeping their products more financially accessible, for example, than those of Earthy Contemporary Craft Council, they've helped shift the design narrative by blending together international art movements like Dadaism with local craft. So this blend of culture, time, and social spaces pushes the boundaries of craft, again, and through their product, creating interest in the local design scene, while also providing beautiful items to purchase and take home. And a quick case study that is near to my heart is one, we're bringing it back to Saudi Arabia now. This product is called Koob, and it's actually from Al-Mashtal. So Koob was designed as part of a souvenir challenge that was put on by Al-Mashtal. And I think a really particularly interesting thing to highlight about this cup is how, at initial glance, you can probably pick out one piece of culture from Saudi Arabia, but with an explanation comes a completely other. So the cup was based off of al-ula, these like rock structures. I'll just go back to my last slide quick. You can see how it has quite organic shapes, but then also quite sharp lines to it as well. That was inspired by al-ula and these really organically shaped rocks, but then these very intentional and man-made cuts into them. But the shape of the cup also came out of a conversation on coffee drinking traditions within Saudi Arabia, and how this back and forth movement of a cup is a way to say no to more coffee. So the idea is that the cup actually can tilt and sit on its side. So rather than having to decline another coffee, the cup itself can mimic that back and forth movement and sit on its side. I think it's a particularly good example of how culture and tradition can be used in contemporary design, because not only is it a beautiful object, but it also brings a story home. The amount of times that I've actually told people about al-ula and about coffee drinking just because of this specific mug, that's me sharing a cultural narrative, and it creates an opportunity for learning and growing between different groups of people. So I think it was done particularly well. My last little session is a take-home activity I'd like to run through, and it's just, I'll be equipping you with some tools on how to think about bringing design and culture together. So what I typically use is that I call it break down and build up. And it's how I can take elements of culture, possibly completely unrelated to my design, for example, using food traditions to inspire clothing designs, and how I can break down to really get to the bottom of these practices to have a very thorough understanding of them, and then rebuild them back up into a product or an inspiration for a product. So this quick list here of the breakdown questions are what I ask about specific practices in order to gain that valuable information. So I'll let you read through them, but there are things like, how can this practice or technique, how is it interwoven with other aspects of the group culture? What are the cultural values of the group who practices this technique or produce this practice? So it's really a way of asking questions to dig down deep into a certain practice. And then building up is asking the questions with the right ethical background in mind. So how can I meaningfully engage with the cultural practice? How should I engage with the practitioners of this technique? How should I speak about this project? So it's keeping you conscious of the way that you pull in inspiration, but then also the way in which you build a product from that inspiration, and making sure that it's positioned in a way that's comfortable for everyone. And reading culture is a real important part of this process, something that all designers should be able to do if they're ever wanting to collaborate with any elements of culture or heritage. So objects hold a lot of meaning within craft and heritage items. There's so much to read and try to understand, and I think it's important to highlight these aspects quickly because it helps to build better products. So the first is understanding color. Every color has a meaning within specific cultural groups, and often one color in one culture means something completely different in another. Having an understanding of that helps towards designing a great product. Understanding motif as well. It takes time to decorate an object. It's easier just to do it without decoration. So why do we as humans make this effort? It's to communicate. So really trying to understand motifs is very important. Understanding the material. This will shed a lot of light on where they're sourced, what local supply chains look like, local economies. Understanding the maker. This is also vital. You know, who is making your product? What is their life like? What are their schedule like? What are their needs? And understanding use. Often items will hold significance spiritually, and making sure that if you are ever designing with heritage or cultural practice, that the design that you're using doesn't misplace the object, that it still retains that significance within society. And again, the essential notion of appreciation and appropriation. And finally, a quick reflection on ethics before you leave. Whether a designer, a consumer, or a participant at any level of the tourism industry, it's always important to keep ethics as a key consideration. So these can be questions like, do I have the right to interact with this practice? Is the way that I plan to use this item once purchased appropriate in the eye of the maker? How are the activities that we have helping to continue cultural practices while allowing them to grow and evolve organically? And that, I hope, with that, I hope that everyone through this session has seen some of the opportunities, the questions and ideas surrounding culture, design, sustainability, and how that can interact with tourism. Culture is an essential part of our human condition, and it needs to be protected and promoted through all avenues, including tourism. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. And I would just like to thank everybody. I know I'm a few minutes over as well, so thank you for sticking with me and for your attention. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا للسيدة ماجي على هذه الإضافة وعلى إدارة الجلسة، وأيضا التفضل بالتكرم بمعلوماتها. إذا كان هناك مجال لطرح الأسئلة والمداخلات فتفضلوا في خانة المحادثة. إذن شكرا جزيلا على تواجدكم. في نهاية هذا المطاف لا يسعنا إلا أن نشكر جميع الحضور على تواجدهم وأيضا تفاعلهم ومداخلاتهم الثرية. الشكر موصول لصندوق التنمية السياحي، لمركز نمو السياحة أيضا، ولحاضنة المشتل الإبداعية، ونتمنى أن تجمعنا بكم جلسات نوعية قادمة تسهم بإذن الله في إثراء القطاع السياحي وتزهر من خلالها مشاريعكم بإذن الله. شكرا جزيلا لحضوركم وحسن استماعكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.